Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey Adapters, welcome back to another exciting episode. In this pod, we're going to learn about a new report from the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. Alfredo Gomez, the director of the Natural Resources and Environment Program at the GAO, starts us off, giving us a broad overview of this new climate resilience report that includes recommendations for adaptation planning to Congress. Then executive producer and recurring guest Dr. Jesse Keenan of Tulane University joins me for a deeper dive into the report. Jesse walks us through why this type of congressional resilience work is so important and the challenges of integrating economic and scientific data into policy. Both will share their insights on the report's 4 major recommendations that can guide congressional actions on climate resilience. Staff from the GAO reached out to the podcast to share this report, and we thought it'd be great to share with my listeners. And Jesse has a history on this podcast of diving into these federal adaptation reports and breaking down the key points for us. We also talk about the importance of congressional action on climate adaptation with a new administration coming in early 2025. And you also hear how these recommendations can benefit the work you're doing at the local and state level. You're going to learn a ton in this episode. Okay, upcoming episodes. I went to Washington, D.C. and attended the U.S. Department of Defense Energy and Environment Innovation Symposium. I got to learn about some innovative adaptation work DoD is funding. Great stuff is on the way. All right, before we dive into this episode, I want to share some exciting news. I'm heading back to the Innovations in Climate Resilience Conference hosted by Battelle. This will be my 3rd time attending, and I hope to see many of you there. Battelle's 4th annual Innovation in Climate Resilience Conference, or ICR 25, will take place April 21st through 23rd, 2025 in Washington, D.C. The themes are Partner, Accelerate, Launch. ICR 25 will bring together the brightest minds from industry, government, and academia to tackle the urgent need for scalable solutions to address climate change. The conference will focus on critical areas like adaptation to help communities and ecosystems prepare for climate impacts, mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and sustainability to create long-term solutions for a healthier planet. It's an incredible opportunity to collaborate, innovate, and shape a sustainable future for generations to come. Early bird registration is now open, so don't wait. Sign up today and be part of the change. Visit battelle.org/innovations in climate resilience to learn more. That's battelle.org/innovations in climate resilience. I'll have links in my show notes. Support for America Adapts comes from Battelle, where science and technology are applied to help create a safer, healthier, more resilient world. Okay, let's learn what GAO is recommending to Congress for climate resilience. Hey Adapters, welcome back to a very exciting episode. Joining me is Alfredo Gomez. Alfredo is the director of the Natural Resources and Environment Program in the U.S. Government Accountability Office. Hi Alfredo, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Doug, thank you for having me.
So let's ground my listeners first. Not everyone knows what it is. What is the Government Accountability Office? And we're going to refer to it as the GAO going forward.
Sure. The GAO we're a congressional agency, so we're Congress's oversight agency, and we are responsible for conducting audits, reviews, studies, sometimes issuing legal opinions, wherever the federal dollar goes. And so myself and my group is responsible for overseeing most of our environmental work that goes on, including our climate change work.
You just said it, but I want to reiterate it, that it's a congressional, and sometimes people always associate things as being a part of the executive branch, and you're a different agency than that. I just want to emphasize that point.
Exactly. So we are a legislative agency. We work for Congress, and we're its oversight agency. Yes, like the Congressional Budget Office, Congressional Research Service, the Government Accountability, or GAO, is part of the legislative family, is what we call it.
And I didn't realize it, but tell us a bit about the Natural Resource and Environment Program that you're part of.
Yeah, so we're a team at GAO, and our portfolio is basically to oversee federal funds at the Department of the Interior, Department of Energy, the Corps of Engineers, the Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Agriculture, and then the food part of the Food and Drug Administration. So we have a fairly broad portfolio, and I'm the director responsible, as I noted, for the environmental protection work, which includes coordinating a lot of our climate change work that we do.
I actually have you on this podcast because we're going to talk about a new report that you guys have out, and I'm going to read it. Climate Resilience, Congressional Action Needed to Enhance Climate Economics Information and to Limit Federal Fiscal Exposure. And why now? Why this report? And we're going to dig into it a bit, but so why this report?
Sure. So maybe I should also mention GAO does its work from requests from congressional committees or leadership in the House or Senate. And this was a request that came to us from Senator Maria Cantwell and also Senator Collins. And what they had asked us to do was to look at what are the financial risks, right, that the federal government faces from climate change. And then also we had issued a report a few years ago where we recommended that Congress put in place an organizational arrangement to better figure out where we're going to invest resources for climate resilience projects. And so these requesters essentially asked us to provide more detail to that question. So that's the genesis of this work and the reason for the work.
As we dig into this, I want to make it clear too, is that first off, I want you to talk about these 4 major recommendations that are part of the report. And those are different than these 5 elements. And you're just using different language there, but we're going to get into both of those. But let's start there with those 4 major recommendations.
Yeah, the 4 recommendations include those 5 elements. And so I can break down those recommendations if that would be helpful. For example, the first recommendation, and really we call these, when we make recommendations to federal agencies, and then when it comes to Congress, we call it matters for congressional consideration, which are essentially, we're recommending that Congress consider doing X or Y, right? The first recommendation in our report is that Congress should consider establishing an organizational arrangement, right, to be able to prioritize climate resilience projects in terms of where we're investing climate resilience. And that this arrangement, right, should have these 5 elements that we talked about. And I can break down those 5 elements at this point, if it makes sense, because these 5 elements are really related to a lot of our previous work that we've done, including some new work as well.
Yeah, let's do that more broadly. Let's just jump in between those things.
Sure. The 5 elements that we think are essential, right, for setting up this organizational arrangement, for the government to decide where it's going to invest its resources for climate resilience projects. And these elements are that the federal government needs to, or at least the Congress needs to designate a federal agency to set up and establish and develop a national climate resilience strategic plan. And this plan will help guide the country's efforts to adapt to climate change. The second thing is that Congress should also consider establishing a national climate information system. And this is from our previous work where we've noted and reported that there is a need to have an authoritative set of climate projections and observations. And this would be data that also would be updated so that we would have the best available data and information that decision makers and others can use. The third thing is that Congress should designate a federal entity, and again, this is based on previous work, to develop and support the use of climate economics information. This is something that climate information in terms of what are the economic effects of climate change. This is an evolving area of work. The results are imprecise, but they do give us really useful insights into where the risks are and perhaps where we should be focusing our federal efforts. The fourth thing is that there should be also a consistent approach for prioritizing climate resilience investments. Currently in the federal government, this is fragmented. Each agency is doing different things in climate resilience. But really, if we're going to look overall in terms of how we should do this, we need to have a consistent approach in terms of deciding, again, where the federal government decides to invest resources. And then lastly, we've also reported that there is a need for what we call a community-driven climate migration project. And this is a way to move people out of harm's way. By doing a project, we can learn from it to then be able to do this in the future. Those are the 5 elements that we talk about that are sort of part of this big recommendation on establishing a federal organizational arrangement. And then really the other recommendations that are in the report, Doug, are essentially some of them that I've already mentioned, right? That Congress should consider designating a federal entity to develop a strategic plan. And then we detail what that strategic plan should have, should define federal priorities. They should clarify roles and responsibilities. For us, this is all sort of standard things that need to happen. And again, this is not to say that there aren't some of these things happening. There is progress in a lot of those areas, but it's not, in our belief, at the point where we think it's been completed.
Let's dig into that a little bit. And this gets wonky, but my listeners are very wonky. So we're going to do that. And I highly recommend, I'll have a link to the actual report in the show notes to this. It's a very readable report. I applaud you guys. I was reading, I'm like, oh, this is very interesting. And so some of the language that you use in there is you talk about this GAO disaster resilience framework. And I just want to clarify too, because the president released his own resilience framework last year. And these are two different things, right? Could you clarify?
Yes, those are different things. The disaster resilience framework, it's a framework that GAO developed, and it's a framework that auditors, but also federal folks and even state and local folks can use as a way to assess when they're coming up with actions on how to deal with disasters and build resilience. It has a couple of different principles and questions that are asked to be able to come with better ways in terms of addressing the issues. This is what we call criteria that we use to assess policies or to figure out what more needs to be done. It's something that GAO developed based on our many years of work that we've done on disasters and disaster response, recovery, resilience. And so it's something that we as auditors use to be able to assess federal actions and whether those actions need to be improved or whether they're sufficient. And it's things like the three principles that we have. It's like information. Essentially, we ask a series of questions. Does the agency have the information that it needs to make decisions or to be able to quantify the effects? And so another principle we call is integration. And then the last principle is incentives, meaning that sometimes you can provide incentives or incentivize actors to do different things. And so these are just different ways to look at it. And that's the disaster resilience framework as one of the criteria that we use. But going back to your question about what is it that the federal government is doing on these recommendations, if we take the recommendation, for example, for a need for a national climate resilience strategic plan, there are a number of things that are happening in the executive side of government. And one of those was that agencies were directed to develop climate adaptation plans, right? Each agency had to do its own. Those have been published. There is a national climate task force. There's the climate policy office. There is a national climate resilience framework. So there's a lot of different things out there, right? But we don't think that goes to the level of our recommendation, which is really looking at a national climate resilience strategic plan, right? Where you're going to bring together all of the federal efforts. And then in that plan, clearly identifying what agencies are expected to do, by when, the resources that are needed. By the way, many other countries have national climate strategic plans. And so that we're a big country. But this is something that we've recommended in the past, and we continue to say this is needed because there's a lot of different things going on, but not a national strategic plan.
I think we're one of two or three countries and they call them generally overseas as national adaptation plans. They're not using the term resilience so much, but basically the same thing. I want to talk about this information because I think this is very interesting. So do you guys get prescriptive in the sense that what's blocking better federal coordination in using climate services for this risk? Because a big challenge is data sharing, and even between federal agencies, they're not necessarily, one agency might have it, but the other agency might not be sharing it. How do we get through that? Is that part of your recommendation?
So one of the recommendations, right, and again, this is based on previous work, and we're also updating it. One of the recommendations is that Congress should consider establishing a national climate information system. And again, in this work that we did, we looked at other countries in terms of how they've set up climate information systems, and then translating that information so that users are able to use it. And this is an example, again, where there is information that's being generated by federal agencies. For example, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, for example, has information that they put out that's climate related. The National Climate Assessment, the most recent one, I think that's the 5th National Climate Assessment that comes out of the Executive Office of the President. They provide, for example, climate observations and projections. And so agencies are usually gathering data and information, sometimes to meet their mission, but it isn't what we think of as an authoritative data set, right, of observations and projections that can then be updated over time. And yes, sometimes these agencies aren't working together as well. And so this is an outstanding recommendation that we've made, and we're making it again in this report because there's a need of it. And also in interviews that we've had with agency officials and experts, they've all landed in the same place that yes, there is a need for an authoritative set of data that can be collected. And then there's really a need here for non-federal actors to then take the data and further translate it for users at all levels of government, local, state, and even the private sector. And we've learned from our work in the past that decision makers need information. Just take, for example, if you're a municipality trying to decide how high you should elevate a bridge because of that it's being affected by extreme weather events and flooding, what data do you go to and where do you get it and how high should you have it? And those are common things that we hear in our work when we go out and talk to folks. So that's another example where things are happening, but we believe that more needs to be done.
Yeah, that's certainly coming up a lot on my podcast is climate data, climate modeling. And NOAA obviously is providing a lot of information. And what's very interesting is I think the premier data network that they had, it's housed in Asheville and actually went offline for a bit. Yeah, the premier kind of climate information warehouse was impacted by climate change. And so I haven't heard more recently, but just.
We were aware of that. Yes, exactly. So there's also tools that are being developed, right? But again, there's a lot of different things going on, but we don't think that there's a centralized effort here.
There are a lot of people out there in the private sector and nonprofits and local government, state government that would love to see a national adaptation plan. And as you'll hear, that's my preference instead of calling it a national resilience plan. And there was an effort, and I actually did a podcast with the author of a bill for national adaptation plan coming out of Senator Chris Coons of Delaware's office. And it's been a couple of years. And it seemed like there was some bipartisan interest in that. Obviously, could you tell us a bit, did you guys look at that? Were there things that overlap? Because it called for a national plan, and I think it called for a chief adaptation officer. But how did you guys look at some of the existing or other legislative efforts?
Yeah, so we do take a look at what's happening, obviously, first with the executive in terms of the agencies. And then we look to see if there's any legislative sort of activity in that area. And so sometimes GAO is asked to look at bills and look at things and provide some comment. But yeah, there's been things, usually things are introduced like in bills and things like that. And then we look to see if anything makes it beyond that. But that is an outstanding recommendation that we've had going back to a number of years. And that's still something that we're tracking.
And I think why there's a lot of interest in that too is that, and could you elaborate, because you're there providing information to Congress, and there are these executive orders that cover some of the same ground, but what's the difference from the executive branch putting out this language versus actually taking congressional action? Why is it so important that Congress does this?
If Congress does it, right, and Congress passes a law, then it transcends administrations. You just mentioned executive orders. So the current administration has several executive orders that are climate related, which is why a lot of federal agencies have been taking actions. The requirement to develop climate adaptation plans comes from one of the executive orders. The reason Congress, and the reason why sometimes we recommend Congress do it, is because also agencies and officials tell us that they require additional authorities, congressional authorities, to take action. Some of those recommendations that we make, as I said earlier, are for agencies because we believe agencies can do it. They have the authority. In other areas, if people are telling us and we come to the same conclusion that it requires additional congressional action, and that's when we go to Congress. And in this case, right, telling Congress to designate, directing by law an agency to develop, in this case, a national climate adaptation plan is something that would transcend administrations, and that would be the nation's plan, according to something that Congress mandated. Just another example, if we're going to get wonky here. For example, Department of Defense has a directive from Congress to every year report on how they're dealing with climate impacts and the vulnerability of their sites and what they're doing. So that's in law, and they have to do that every year, regardless of what administration comes and goes.
One of the things that interests me is that part of these elements is this community-driven climate migration pilot program. And that's just another way of saying managed retreat. And that's very specific. So when I saw that, I'm like, oh, wow, you guys are recommending this. And there are efforts. It's more in academic circles right now talking about managed retreat. But I almost feel that you guys went out there and said, here's something very specific we could be doing. And what I like about it, you look at all these different other elements, it would integrate those. And here's a real world on the ground practical application of that. And so was that sort of the purpose of that?
Exactly. And people have actually pointed this particular one out because it's a little different, right, from the other recommendations. As you said, it's very specific, but it's also very specific because, again, this is based on some previous work that we've done. For example, we've done a couple of reports now looking at how Alaska Native villages are affected by flooding and erosion and climate change. And in those examples, it was very difficult for these communities to figure out how they're going to even retreat, right? And they've chosen to retreat in a lot of these cases, but they needed help from federal agencies, from the state of Alaska, for example. And then we also did a more recent report where we were looking at other areas of the U.S. For example, there was a community in Eastern Maryland and Louisiana and a community in Northern California that had been devastated by wildfires. Again, looking at this question of how is the federal government organized to help communities retreat? And we're not well organized. The reason to do this pilot project again is to learn from it. And I think in our report where we talk about this community-driven climate migration pilot program, we talk a little bit about what's been done in the past, and there's mention of these tribal communities, and then a tribal subcommittee that's been set up in the current administration to work on these topics. Yes, this is one that we know from our work, and we know that this is an issue. And also, we know that this is going to be an issue more and more in the future as people have to migrate away from the coasts or from river communities or wherever harm's way comes.
I'm very encouraged because people are somewhat in denial about these are the things that are going to have to happen. And the fact that the government starts thinking about it and offering practical pathways for it, that's just very responsible thinking. And so I certainly appreciate this. Another area is that your report cites the challenge of ad hoc funding for climate resilience projects. And so this is very interesting that what was very exciting in the last 3.5, 4 years is that you had some major legislation. And I'm wondering if you guys have been able to compare, is it apples and oranges, like the infrastructure bill? And then you had the Inflation Reduction Act where money was actually allocated to resilience and adaptation on the ground, which rarely happens because the planning has been going on for years, but here's some actual money. But part of the problem is that the metrics, the sort of standards that are set for what is adaptation is all over the place. And is that part of what you're trying to address here too?
Yeah. So in this recommendation, right, we're talking about that there's a need for a consistent approach, right, to identify and prioritize these climate resilience projects for federal investment. Now, and you noted earlier too that there's a number of different pots right now, right, that are giving money or that monies are directed for building resilience. And there are monies that are in the Inflation Reduction Act. There are monies that were in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. FEMA, for example, also has their Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program, which we call the BRIC program, which is also focused on resilience. So there's a number of things out there now, right, that are taking place. FEMA even has created what they call the Community Disaster Resilience Zones to help build disaster resilience across the nation. There's a number of things going on, and GAO is doing some oversight of some of these programs because Congress mandated us, for example, to do oversight of the IRA monies and where they're going. And yes, there's a lot of money at the moment out there in different places, but we do still believe that we need, for those big federal investments that we're going to be doing into the future, we need a really good approach, right, about How do we identify them? How do we prioritize them? Because people always will bring up equity considerations, for example, because there are communities perhaps that don't have the capacity to organize themselves and apply for these grants or monies. And how do we make it fair?
I've gotten pretty good at reading some of these government reports, but I'm not. There's language and there's subtleties too that I still pick up on. And you're not there to necessarily to make recommendations when it comes to regulatory powers. There's a whole series here, but there's a difference between sort of policy prescriptions and then things that are like to the level of, okay, certain regulatory changes need to be made. And then also the notion of recommending things need to have budgets. A lot of people in the federal government saying that this is really for real until there's a budget associated to it. Could you just elaborate on that? Is the report getting to that level?
Again, maybe I should have also said this in the beginning, Doug. So when GAO does climate change work, because we're auditors and the GAO, we look at it from the growing federal fiscal exposure that the government is experiencing in a variety of areas. Government infrastructure, the National Flood Insurance Program, the National Crop Insurance Program, the amount of money we spend on disaster assistance, all of these things are going up. And so we look for ways to limit that federal fiscal exposure. And one way is looking across federal programs in ways in which you can build resilience, you can better adapt, you can invest now to save in the future. And so we are always focused on limiting that fiscal exposure. And sometimes our recommendations are focused on that, right? How can we do this better in the monies that we're spending? How can we ensure that we build in resilience, or we ensure that we build it back stronger and better so that we don't have to rebuild it again when it's destroyed? And so when we make recommendations, they're improving the programs. We might call out to Congress and say there's additional authorities that are needed, as we were saying earlier, to accomplish the goals that have been set. But yeah, aside from that, the policy also is something that we leave for the policy makers as well. And so that's where GAO is usually landing.
And for me, one of the big takeaways is that at the big picture with all these recommendations, that you're trying to save taxpayers' money, save the federal government money. These are some of the steps that you can do as we start thinking about climate change. That certainly was a major takeaway for me there too. Before I let you go, this is a response to two senators in Congress, but I have a lot of listeners who are in local government, state government, and they could learn from this, and that they're going through their own processes. Any sort of recommendations to them, how they could use this report?
Yeah, so the report also is identifying and discusses in a variety of places, right? The various federal programs that are involved, at least what's known about the economic impacts of climate change to the federal government. And those are, as you can already imagine, impacts to federal infrastructure, to the federal insurance programs, to the disaster programs. And then also from the National Climate Assessment, right? There's a lot of information there about where the climate change effects are across the country, different geographic regions, different economic sectors. So there is a lot of information there for local and state people to use. And by the way, there is also like a state resiliency working group that exists that comes together where they share information and knowledge about how to build resilience across the country.
Yes, and I do have a lot of federal government listeners too, so I highly recommend you guys take a look at this because this is just I think, wonky, deep thinking around adaptation that needs to happen, so I certainly appreciate it. Okay, if there's a major takeaway you want people to have?
And really, the bottom line of this report, right, is that Congress needs to do a better job to organize the federal government to invest in climate resilience projects, right, so that we can help the nation buy down its large and growing climate-related costs.
Alfredo, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing what you're doing with the report. It's important work.
Thank you for having me, Doug.
Hey, Adapters. Welcome back to a very exciting episode. Joining me is Dr. Jesse Keenan. Jesse is a Favreau Associate Professor of Sustainable Real Estate and Urban Planning and the Director of the Center on Climate Change and Urbanism within the Faculty of the School of Architecture at Tulane University. Hey, Jesse. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Doug.
Jesse, it's always a treat to have you on. And I was thinking about this. I haven't actually tallied it up, but you've probably been on the most of this podcast. It's fantastic to have you back. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Doug, I've got an unfortunate disposition of cheating, being the executive producer.
Yes.
I probably put myself on more than I want to or need to, so I just want to apologize in advance.
No, your episodes are always so popular, and yeah, it's a treat to have you on. I just had Alfredo Gomez on. He's the director of the Natural Resources Environment Program at GAO, and so I've got you on, and we're going to take a deeper dive into that report that he was giving us that 30,000 foot view at. Can you give me a little bit of background on that?
Yeah, first of all, GAO, wow, they've got a lot of work cut out for them. They've always done, I think, great work in the past to formally hold the government accountable, but they're doing so very often through the lens of fiscal accountability. And what we see in this new report is looking at our work across the federal government specific to climate adaptation through the lens of fiscal accountability and fiscal exposure more formally for the U.S. government. At the end of the day, as they outline, it's about increased costs and decreased revenue. And the question is, what do you do about that? How do we make sense of the world and advance our economic and advance also the collection of data and information to help make better decisions to manage that fiscal exposure? And as they note, specific to climate economics, quote, these studies produce imprecise results due to modeling and data limitations. And it's a kind of type 1, type 2 errors along the way, but it's a combination of the lack of maturity associated with climate modeling, which in some areas is very good and quite advanced. And I really can't speak to that as a disciplinarian. But on another level, it's also a lack or a false sense of precision that we sometimes get in climate services, where we just don't have as great of physical climate risk information and data as you would think that we would have. And so it's a combination of two maturing areas of science, supply, and social science that together are maturing and evolving and developing and getting better, but they're not quite to the point where they can support the kind of decision making that we need to manage fiscal exposure. So as they highlight, there are useful insights. That's their language, not mine. But at the end of the day, this lack of analytical capacity, broadly speaking, across the federal government is a problem. And the Biden administration has issued executive orders. There's been OMB guidance. And what they've really been trying to do is just on a really basic level related to fiscal exposure, get agencies and departments to begin to report climate-related financial risks. And so the GAO report at the end of the day is evaluating how successful have they been. And I just want to read some quotes from the report itself because I think it stands on its own. One quote is, quote, federal agencies have little capacity to report their climate-related financial risks and improve their reporting about those risks. It goes on to say that, quote, agency financial reports from the fiscal years 22 and 23 contain little and varied information on climate-related financial risk. So basically, little capacity. There's not a lot of work. It's not mostly qualitative to that end. So GAO goes out and tries to understand why is that, right? They interview people. They're talking to experts inside and outside of government. They really do their homework, and they make an argument for 5 key policy opportunities that Congress can consider. In this case, this GAO report was solicited and ordered by members of the Senate. And what GAO is not policy prescriptive. They're not setting out policies, but they're saying these are areas where Congress has the opportunity to act. It's also worth noting a little bit of an aside, because this is America Adapts, that, and we talk about adaptation science, their frame of reference is disaster resilience, which is distinct from adaptation. It tends to focus on episodic notions of shock, which of course overlooks this broader transformational implications with stress and adaptation more broadly. And so we cut off a lot of kind of conceptualization. But at the end of the day, their focus on disaster resilience as a way to manage uncertainty and risk in the context of shocks, extreme events, is certainly appropriate and useful, but it's also limiting because it's not fully fleshing out the full range of economic implications, particularly macroeconomic implications.
You'd mentioned there are these 5 policy recommendations to Congress, and we're going to go through each of them. But let's just get people started. What are they at the broader level? And then we'll dig into them on an individual basis.
Yeah, again, these are opportunities for Congress to do something, to investigate further, and to develop some potential draft legislation to debate and push forward. One's an as we move forward with a Republican-controlled government, listeners are probably thinking, oh, this is ridiculous. None of this will ever pass. None of this will ever move forward. Keep in mind, this was actually ordered by bipartisan members of Congress. While it may not exist as a standalone piece of legislation, it's no doubt still worth going forward and thinking about these things, because sometimes they get relabeled and climate gets removed, and it's called disaster resilience and things like that. It's functionally doing the same thing, but under a different title, and it gets slipped into appropriations bills and things like that. So this is still a useful exercise. It doesn't have the same life that it would have had on a different outcome with the election. Just keep in the back of your mind that maybe there's a little bit of optimism in here in an otherwise somewhat dark or entirely dark time for climate policy. The 5 potential opportunities here is to develop a national climate resilience strategic plan. We've talked about that on here a good bit. We'll come back to what that means. Develop or design a national climate information system. We have a huge deficits and gaps, not only in the primary science, but the application of various science and social science data and indicators to help make decisions in the name of adaptation, risk reduction, and the like. Expand the use of economics information, which is really important from the point of view of you're an agency, you're a department, you're trying to incorporate this within budgeting, exposure analysis, long-term understanding of costs and revenue. And this is the 4th dimension, a consistent approach for prioritizing climate resilience investments. So it's one thing to manage what you're doing in-house and thinking about the broader sort of macro economy of your position as an agency or a department. It's a whole other, or across the federal government more broadly, it's a whole other thing to think about what do we do when we make investments in resilience and adaptation, and what are the opportunities for standardizing and bridging different sectoral points of view and different departmental points of view, which sometimes are in conflict with each other. And finally, this is a really interesting place to start, is to develop or advance a community-driven climate migration pilot program. And that seems a little bit off the mark, but really at the end of the day, people are on the move, the tax base is on the move, there are different dimensions of economic production and activity that will be on the move in the light of climate change, relocation, migration, change preferences, sorting. There's a lot of different, in a broader context of mobility, there's a lot of different ways to think about that. But it's included in here. And the way GAO positions all of these things is they systematically work as a package, that any kind of advanced movement to thinking about resilience and the governance of resilience and adaptation needs to consider all of these major elements.
We're going to dig into all 5 of these. We're not going to follow the same order that you just described them. We're actually going to start off with the one you just talked about, the community-driven climate migration pilot program. And I just want to say, I thought this was very interesting when I saw this here. We talk about managed retreat and whatever the terminology, but it seemed like they got very specific, and sometimes this is considered very controversial. So I was mildly surprised it was there. And so take us through this.
Yeah, I was surprised it was there too, but at the same time, I'm also recognized that there is a track record here. The executive branch has, in the Biden administration, even before that, before the Biden administration, there has been work on this. But before we get to that, let's outline, as they do in the report, and this is a wonderful graphic that they have in the report, the various ways that adaptation is organized within the executive branch, or really within and through the Executive Office of the President. You have EOP, Executive Office of the President, and then you have Office of Science and Technology and Policy. You have Council on Environmental Quality. You have Office on, which, by the way, Council on Environmental Quality historically was there to guide NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act. And by the way, just a couple of days ago, there was a district ruling in D.C., a federal district court ruling in D.C. that said that NEPA doesn't even have the authority to issue regulations for NEPA, which is, it was essentially a ultra vires acts of regulation, which, man, that seems really problematic, particularly in a post-Chevron world. And you see where deference now is quickly eroding and leaves CEQ with not much to do if that holds up, probably ultimately before the Supreme Court. So anyway, you have the Office of Management and Budget. That's about exactly what it sounds, the budgeting, economy side of things. We have the Climate Policy Office, which really doesn't do any adaptation work. You have National Security Council, which does do some resilience and adaptation work, and we'll talk about that. And then there's the Office of Clean Energy and Innovation Implementation. They don't do anything related to adaptation, really. But within that broader realm, you have a bunch of interagency task groups and working groups. So you have the National Climate Task Force, and there's the Resilience Interagency Working Group, and they break down by all these subgroups: coastal, flood, drought, wildfire. And within that, if you keep breaking down the kind of org chart, there's a committee on community-driven relocation. And there's other committees and sub-working groups on infrastructure and interagency resilience efforts. And I definitely encourage listeners to go and look at the report because the org chart is really interesting. And we're going to go through that indirectly when we talk about various policies and programs that connect. But buried down in this National Climate Task Force is this subcommittee on climate-driven relocation. It's technically chaired by the Department of Interior, FEMA, CEQ, and OSTP. And the reason it exists more than anything, one, there's a need, but two, there was money carved out from Inflation Reduction Act to help fund something. Now, there had already been policy in the federal government associated with relocating, particularly tribal relocation. And by the way, let me back up for a second. The money that came out of the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, was for tribal relocation, the kind of pilot program. This committee is building on what had been a little bit of a momentum. The Department of Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs had already had a tribal climate annual awards program for giving out money, and HUD had issued some guidance on community relocations. Interestingly enough, historians have gone back and looked at this. There's over 200 really solid cases, and solid in terms of being well documented, cases of moving entire communities associated with environmental because in response to various environmental dimensions and conditions. So there's actually a lot of history of moving people in this context throughout the United States. Nonetheless, within the tribal relocation pilot program, in the workings of this subcommittee, it highlights, and I don't want to get too far into this because frankly, there's not a lot to go into, but it highlights how under-resourced and understaffed adaptation has been in the federal government, even during the Biden administration. So here we have all of this money from the IRA, and it's supposed to help tribal communities move from sending zones to receiving zones. How under-resourced are you, if you will ask? Well,
much.
It has essentially two people running the program side of this. One person's partly engaged at CEQ on this. This is like part of their portfolio work. But the real person doing most of the legwork is a guy, and I'm not going to call him out with too much precision here, but it's a guy at FEMA who's doing this really, he's a full-time employee, but he's doing this as part of his own portfolio work. His background is he's a GIS specialist. And before he came to FEMA, he was doing mapping for the Philly DA's office, Larry Krasner, the progressive district attorney. So the guy shows up at FEMA, gets tasked with probably one of the more difficult jobs to coordinate and have interagency coordination on the movement of people and communities and infrastructure and programs and services and the whole thing, with no background in any of this, right? He might be a good mapper, but he's not well socialized or not socialized at all and really just doesn't have the technical and subject matter expertise. When you talk to people about the order of challenge, the order of magnitude of the challenge of simply what sounds simple of moving a community or a tribal community, it says, oh yeah, sure, housing here, you build some housing, water systems, wastewater, it's infrastructural. People think of materials. It's so much more complicated than that. And it would probably take 1,000 civil servants working full time to do this well across multiple agencies. And here we are, we have all this money, and we've got this mapper, this GIS person who has zero expertise, zero relationships, and expect that person is going to get anything done.
Wow.
So at the end of the day, you can assign money to a problem, but without sufficient congressional authorization, staff, and ultimately funding and capacity, even at the federal government level, nothing's going to happen. So as a consequence, this program has absolutely languished, and it's burned a lot of goodwill with tribal partners who say, we got excited about this. We thought something was going to happen, and it completely just went dark. And so when I've talked to a lot of people who participate in this program, they're upset, they're disappointed, but then they're like, at the same time, they're just like, yeah, anticipated this. So interestingly enough, GAO comes in and says, okay, here's a bunch of reasons why people in the federal government think that we need congressional action to solve some of these problems. And maybe where the problems or barriers are opportunities for congressional legislation. So the first, and this is all coming from interviews, right? This is what the beauty of what GAO does. They actually can reach out and talk to people on the ground. So the first problem that people identify is that really local governments are going to really oppose a lot of federal interference, particularly with local land use decisions, right? Forget the tribal side of this. Now we're talking about just broader community climate migration. So anything that you're going to do to shift land use patterns, zoning, it's not how you build, but where you build and the movement of people, federal government's pretty limited. We really only have sort of carrot approaches. We don't have a lot of stick approaches. It's always been designated to states and states that delegate that authority to local governments for the most part, longstanding provision of this under the 10th Amendment. But so the question is, what can we do both stick and carrots? So there needs to be more thinking, particularly about the federal role and engagement around land use decisions. And I think there's an infrastructural stick and carrot there, but nonetheless, that needs to be explored. Others say, quote, requires equity considerations. And sometimes I wish people would just be precise about what they mean. What that really means in practice, and I don't want to completely look down on this community-driven relocation subcommittee because they were tasked with really an impossible thing with not enough people. One of the things that came up in that committee work is how do we triage the beneficiaries? How do we decide who should benefit from a government program and who should not, who should be included and who should be excluded? People have a lot of different opinions about that, even within a community, right? So just saying, oh, you community, you self-organize and you self-govern the range of beneficiaries, that can be quite exclusionary in itself. So these aren't easy answers. These aren't easy questions. The other challenge that someone raises, or several interviewees raises, the crowding out problem in receiving communities, right? So we tend to focus in on sending communities, but we generally don't focus a lot on receiving communities. That's the climate gentrification problem. I will give FEMA a little bit of credit because on the other part of FEMA in BRIC and some other regulations that they have where there are buyout programs, they are increasingly offering guidance and forcing local governments to think about receiving zones. So there is some work in the federal government about that, but I think Congress would be well advised to think about, okay, if you're going to move people, they've got to go somewhere. We really need to think about the nature of receiving zones. This comes up over and over again. At the end of the day, it's going to require an awful lot of congressional authorization to break down barriers and to give people forced authorization. And the question is, even if Congress were to act in a magical land of competency, what would that mean in terms of the executive branch? Because as people highlight in the report, the executive branch generally has been unwilling to stomach the fallout of the rhetoric of forced relocation, right? That is bad at every level of government in terms of political implications. And it's interesting enough, it makes you go back and think about Rexford Tugwell, the New Deal, the Dust Bowl, the Resettlement Administration, why the Resettlement Administration failed in the context of Dust Bowl. It was viewed as a socialist plot of central planning, essentially. But at the end of the day, and we have a long history of regional planning in this country, of course, and particularly in the context of rural and economic development, the Tennessee Valley Authority, for instance, we need to re-engage that knowledge and that base of understanding and practice to really move beyond the politics of forced relocation and the kind of social violence of it on some rhetorical level to think constructively about how we do this. And that's going to require some politicians willing to stand up for that. And that's not going to be easy.
I want to follow up on that. I'm very curious with this whole idea of forced relocation. Do you think for the foreseeable future that it's all going to just be, you think carrot and stick, and it's all just going to be carrot? There's no way that they will use a stick to try to get people to move out of these areas?
Yeah, I think there's a limitation. There's a kind of upper boundaries of how many carrots you can apply. And this absolutely connects to why we need a national adaptation strategy or a national adaptation plan. We need some spatial organization so that we are spending the carrots and spending the dollars in a way that's not re-entrenching vested interests that are unsustainable. There's going to be a real limit and threshold to what those carrots and what those dollars can do to incentivize good behavior. At the end of the day, we have to be precise and give full recognition that some places are really beyond our even technical, not political capacity, but beyond our technical capacity to preserve and to conserve as we know them today.
That's a nice pivot there. So the next policy recommendation is the National Climate Resilience Strategic Plan. And before you dig into that, we've talked about this before, and I've done a whole episode on it. Why don't they just call it the National Adaptation Plan? That's what every other country does. It would create a common language. I think it would just be an easier sell to the public than this kind of boring stuff. And could you also maybe talk about in the context of the National Resilience Framework that the Biden administration released last year, how these are all connected?
Yeah. So let's go back to 2015 and the Paris Accord. Paris, formerly through Article 7, the Paris Accord, finally adaptation reaches parity with mitigation, right? And it gets elevated to this recognition among countries that it is a valid and very important dimension of investment of how we respond and work within the context of climate change. And in Article 7, signatories have an obligation to submit an adaptation communication. And that gets framed within a broader movement of countries for national adaptation plans. I think all of the G20 countries, except for the United States, have a national adaptation plan. Everybody has an adaptation communication. Most adaptation communications are pretty short. We submitted one in 2021. It was pretty poor. It wasn't even proofread. We talked about that on this show. That was a problem. Interestingly enough, Canada just recently released their national adaptation plan. It's phenomenal. It's like completely worth a read. We need to track down some people and some of our colleagues in Canada, which I know we have these relationships. We need to do a whole episode on them. Because I encourage readers, if you want to see what it can look like, look at what Canada has done. There's dozens of countries in the world who are either fully published a national adaptation plan or are somewhere pretty far along in the process. It was really designed, global north to global south, as a mechanism for the global south to funnel loss and damage dollars and other compensatory mechanisms into adaptation from the global north. That's in the idea that national adaptation plans are really organizing that. But other countries, developed countries, the United States, Japan, Europe, G20 countries, they took it on because they realized it was a useful exercise, not only for themselves, but as part of a global dialogue of policy experimentation to figure out what works and what doesn't work. We just haven't done that in the United States. But let me think optimistically, because there's a lot of pessimism. And it's always easier to blame people and things. And I really don't understand why we haven't done one. From a practical point of view, it'd be pretty easy to do. Look at Canada, what they've done. But we can debate that. But let me be optimistic for a second. In that broader organization of the EOP, Executive Office of the President, the National Security Council, this goes back to 9/11. It goes back to 2005 when Hurricane Katrina. It goes back. There's a long history of resilience sitting in the National Security Council. Our friend Alice Hill has been on here a number of times. She was one of the pioneers in that realm, particularly in the Obama administration, where it really matures. Anyway, recently, something was produced called the National Security Memorandum 22 on critical infrastructure security and resilience. And man, NSM 22, that sounds really boring and really just not what we think of when we think of the National Adaptation Plan. But I will say that it's an exceptionally robust and comprehensive take on how resilience and engineering resilience and disaster resilience, which are their own sort of conceptual things that, of course, are distinct from the broader umbrella of adaptation. But within that narrow range, it's a pretty darn good model of how federal agencies, departments work with state, local governments, but also the private sector to develop the intelligence and the kind of strategic impetus to manage risk, uncertainty, climate impacts, multi-hazard impacts. It's not just climate. So there is like a really good model for this. There is a lot of coordination that has been done. We're not starting from scratch. And NSM 22 is a really, I think, optimistic moment to look back on and say, oh yeah, there's a pretty robust foundation for this, and that can help certainly support broader dimensions of a national adaptation plan. But keep in mind that the other component of developing a national adaptation plan is built on what the agencies have already done, right? And keep in mind that adaptation planning at an agency level is supervised by the Council on Environmental Quality, which is buried within the Office of the Sustainability Officer and what's called the Resilience Team under the Office of the Chief Sustainability Officer. We've talked about this before. CEQ is one of those entities where a lot gets thrown in to CEQ in terms of advocacy and political sort of ambitions, but it yields very little authority or power, even within the Executive Office of the President. There's usually just a few people that are on detail that work, and these people work very hard. but they're under-resourced, understaffed. We've talked about this before. But the foundation for a national adaptation plan would really be built on these agency adaptation plans. These were conceptualized as living documents under Executive Order 1457. We talked in 2021, we had an episode on this podcast about the initial publication of these plans. And then just in 2020, this year, we had another update. But at the end of the day, limited staff capacity, not just at the EOP level, but at the agency level, there's limited technical support and there's limited standardization. And these aren't my opinions. These are the opinions of GAO in their very report. I will tell you that from my own opinion and my own observation on this front, they've done pretty good work. Some agencies are better than others, but they are maturing. They're doing a great job with what little resources they have. But interestingly enough, and this is an interesting kind of social science problem, it really depends on their level of socialization. And there's been training and personnel development on agency plans, but really those plans that are advanced by people who've developed subject matter expertise, but also the relationships in DC in the broader adaptation and resilience community, those are the plans that are the best. They're most robust, the most comprehensive. So it's really interesting to see how just socialization on this front, because it's a very small community of people, really manifests in terms of the quality of these reports. So the question is what are the barriers to a national adaptation plan or a national resilience strategy, as GAO calls it? And so they went out and, of course, asked people, why haven't we had this? We need it. Everybody says we need it, but we don't have it. We're just working at an agency level, which I feel optimistic. I feel like at the agency level, these plans provide the basis. This is the foundation for what would come with an NAP or National Adaptation Plan. So anyway, they go out and they ask people, and this is what people say. They say, we're on a 4-year cycle of administration, relatively short attention span. It's okay, but why is Democratic Republic of Congo and Canada and Haiti and Guyana and the Russian Federation doing this? We can do this. 4-year turnover, I'm not too concerned about this. They say you need no clear congressional authority to integrate or implement a kind of patchwork of programs. So there's always opportunity to start. There's probably more opportunity and authority, particularly within OMB, than we'd like to think, but I think that's a kind of shortcoming that's not fair. Finally, they interviewed some people at OSTP, Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, who said that it would not be, quote, a national plan, as local jurisdictions would do most of the implementation, and they just don't have the staff or the capacity to do the national outreach necessary to even develop a national plan, much less take on climate fiscal exposure. I think that is true on some level. They don't have the staff or the capacity, but there is a model for national outreach. Go back to National Security Memorandum 22. That has a fair amount of outreach in public and private and civic sector engagement, maybe less so in the civic sector. But if OSTB is envisioning some sort of community ground up environmental justice kumbaya, yeah, that's not going to happen. But that's not what a national adaptation plan is designed to do or be. I think they're completely the idea that one would build consensus about the future in a kind of static orientation that is derived from the aggregation of ground up community participation. They're not really conceptualizing that appropriately.
Look, I'm curious, you just mentioned that all these other countries have these national adaptation plans. And it occurs to me, I don't know how much you've dug into those. You mentioned Canada. By the way, we tried to do that episode. I have some Canadian federal government listeners, but we weren't able, I don't think they got permission to do it. So it's still, if you're listening, let's do that. But this whole notion that it doesn't have the capacity or it would be local implementation, isn't this true for all these countries? They don't necessarily have the resources and everything, but they still develop these national adaptation plans. What's different about them that they can do that, and yet many still lack the resources?
Again, it depends on what your ambition is. If from OSTP's point of view, is that this is some kind of ground up EJ, kumbaya, community driven consensus where it requires outreach to millions of people to survey what people want and think and feel. Yeah, we can't do that. But that's not what national adaptation plans are. They are a reflection of the opportunities that executive branches and legislative bodies, the opportunities in terms of legislation, policy, and regulation to allocate resources, to think about how we can fundamentally advance the public good. And to your question, Doug, why is it that DRC and various countries around the world, and by the way, I've read almost all the national adaptation plans and communities in the world, and I'm pretty up to date on it. I do active research in this area. In the Global South, they're supported by a network under the UN FCCC, and there's a whole group of people that actually help, and entities and institutions that help developing countries support these things. But in the G20 countries, they do it on their own. If listeners are interested, look at the Philippines. Philippines has a phenomenal, Indonesia has a really good national adaptation plan, but really the Philippines is phenomenal. It's a great reflection of working together across agencies and boundaries and geographies and very diverse populations, I should say, to really plan for the future. We can do it. I think what we lack, Doug, is political will and a political understanding of what a national adaptation plan is. I think we tend to think we're too big and too complicated and the politics aren't in our favor, but I think it's just a lack of understanding about the process and a lack of engagement in that process to understand what it could or should be. It's a failure of politics, not a failure of resource allocation.
Let's get to the third one, and this is expanding the use of economics information. All right, walk us through this.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. Why did GAO do this? Their argument, and GAO is a unit of Congress. They have a responsibility to understand and hold the branches of government accountable to how we manage our tax dollars. I think that's probably the best way to think about it in its own sense. From their point of view, their climate risk and climate exposure, particularly in terms of higher costs and lower revenue, is a big problem. This is where we start. So let's go back to that. In 2021, Biden issues an executive order 14030. And in there, he basically it's a whole ambition to think about a roadmap for it's titled a roadmap to build a climate resilient economy. But there's two important features in this executive order. One is that the federal government has to manage its own financial risk. And two, and this is the big one, that federal budgeting, financial management reporting needs to account for climate risk, quantitatively or qualitatively. So as GAO looks into this and tries to understand are agencies doing this, they find pretty poor reporting and pretty uneven results. They highlight in the report more precision in some places like DOD and less precision in other places. And in some places, it's just qualitative discussion, which is fine, just hasn't matured. So in the GAO report, they highlight where's this economic information going to come from? Where is this data and resources? Where is it? So they look at it from both a kind of bottom up and a top down point of view. So let's start with where, if I'm in an agency, you and I are sitting at, where'd you work? Department of Interior?
Yeah, National Park Service.
National Park. So you've been elevated now to DOI. You're in charge of trying to figure out your adaptation plan. Where are you going to pull in this broader economic info to shape, I don't know, future revenue from people visiting the parks or something? I don't know, whatever, make it up. So the question is, where do we get this from? There's two sort of perspectives. The first perspective is top-down economy-wide models, right? Primarily represented or understood in the context of GDP. There's three basic areas of information or places where you can begin to kind of source methods, models, and data. One is US GCRP, US Global Change Research Program, and in this case, the National Climate Assessment, which is a compendium of, it's assessment, right? It's just telling you what's out there. And USGCRP has gotten more into climate services. It's incomplete, but they're heading in the direction of being closer to a climate services provider in a way. They highlight, for instance, in the GAO report, that for every 1 degree Fahrenheit increase, it reduces our GDP by 0.13%, which is basically the amount greater. And they highlight that with higher temperature increases, that goes up. So it's not a fixed proportional ratio. But they go on to highlight the Congressional Budget Office, and CBO has taken kind of 10 and 20-year takes at this in terms of budget economic projections. They have a different number, something like estimated like 0.03% reduction in annual GDP. And that is compared to growth that would have occurred without climate change. You have to qualify these findings one way or the other. And ultimately, it all leads down to OMB and the Council of Economic Advisors work. Now, remember that there's all these interagency task forces and working groups. One of those working groups is the Climate-Related Financial Risk Working Group. And within that, there's two subgroups. One's the Climate Macro Interagency Technical Working Group, and the other is the Assessments of Federal Financial Climate Risk Interagency Working Group. It's a mouthful. If you're interested in what they're doing and what their findings are, I would point you to the OMB's analytical perspectives. And this is the analytical perspectives on the budget of the U.S. government. It comes out every year. The one I looked at that was cited in the GAO report, because I had to go back and look through their citations to refresh myself, is really interesting. The 2024 one is fantastic. Like the GAO, they find that it's increased costs, lower revenue, right? And they look at a huge range of budget cost estimates, but they're only looking at it within a pretty narrow range. So they look at Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, GSE, housing exposure. They look at flood risk to federal facilities. They look at heating and cooling assistance, which I thought was pretty interesting. And then they look at federal insurance, not including health insurance. And they begin to highlight and stress these are the different approaches. This is how people think about risk. But of course, it's much bigger than that, much, much broader. But this analytical perspective highlights, one, we have to standardize risk analysis. The agency plans as they see it. Now, this is OMB's perspective, not GAO's perspective, but as they see it, the agency adaptation planning is completely disconnected from the agency budgeting. So we're asking in the agency adaptation plans to highlight your fiscal exposure, the budgeting implications, et cetera, et cetera. But these are two distinct operations. And by the way, this is not uncommon in planning in general, even at a city level where capital planning and land use or infrastructure or city planning are distinct areas. Interestingly enough, a long time ago in the city of New York, they were actually in the same division. They were in the same unit where capital planning, that is the people with the money and the budgets, and the people who were doing the city planning and the spatial planning were all in the same unit, but they were broken up because they were found to be, it was too powerful to have the exercise of regulation and to have the power of the purse in the same division was deemed to be too powerful, and they were broken up. But this is the fundamental problem of the federal government, is that these are two distinct units that are not cooperating or aligned or working with each other, not even speaking the same language for the most part. So as a consequence, most of what you get is a lot of qualitative assessments.
And let me just jump in there, Jesse, because when I did work at DOI, I was one of those folks that attended a lot of meetings that CEQ put together. And I learned very quickly. So this idea of planning, and if it isn't connected to budgeting, it's not taken nearly as seriously, because you could just jump through a lot of these hoops when it comes to the adaptation plans and the executive orders, but everything that it was all related to budgeting. And that's what everyone at DOI and all my coworkers, it's just that there wasn't a budget associated to it. It's just, this is not being taken seriously. And so that needs to change. And I'm guessing it will eventually, but that to me is a pure signal that, all right, are they really taking this seriously?
Yeah. And Doug, that's a point well taken across in and outside of the federal government. I think to date, it's fair to say that a lot of adaptation and resilience work has operated within existing budget line items to stretch them to do something that they weren't fully intended to do, right? And this is particularly true on staff time, where you're asking people to take on these extra task loads that they really weren't budgeted for. And that's been the state of things, operating on the margins, operating on the fringe. That's a good summary of resilience and adaptation across the board. The question is, let's just say in a perfect world that there is this alignment and you do have budgetary authority and allocations, it's funded and the whole thing, and you're feeling good. Where do you go out to get information about climate, particularly physical risk and physical risk exposure? They highlight in this analytical perspectives document published by OMB things like the climate mapping for adaptation and resilience, the CMRA, this assessment tool. But if you ever go and look at the climate mapping for resilience and adaptation assessment tool, listen, I'm sure people work super hard on this, but it's not the level of resolution that the agencies need to do their job, right? It's useful and interesting at a consumer level, maybe at state level, but it's not well organized, communicated, visualized, and otherwise diffused within and among people who are making decisions. If you keep digging further and further into OMB and the Council of Economic Advisors, and you go back and you look at their work and like, how do we get to this place? In 2024, they published a paper, and the paper is entitled, this is a long one, Assessing Methods to Integrate Physical Risks and Transition Risks and Opportunities of Climate Change into the President's Macroeconomic Forecast. So here it is. This is the brain trust. They're saying, all right, everybody, we're going to do this and we're going to look at this from a macroeconomic point of view. And they set up this kind of 4-step process, like project future global greenhouse gas emissions. 2, map the emissions to changes in climate conditions. 3, map changes in climate conditions to macroeconomic indicators. 4, project changes in macroeconomic indicators relative to baseline forecast. It's okay. At every one of those stages, there's a million degrees of direction that one could go into in terms of methods and assumptions and data. None of this is easy. None of this is accessible. It felt like this extremely academic exercise. And by the way, if you go to this one component of this report, and box 3 in particular, they're like, oh yeah, by the way, there's a bunch of structural macroeconomic models that are bottom up that you can also use, integrated assessment models and equilibrium models. And they even talk about agent-based computational models, which if you think that you're going to go to Social Security Administration and tell them to use agent-based computational models to estimate where population flows are going to go so that they can put their Social Security agency offices in the right place in the future, it's not going to happen. It's pretty academic exercise. And they actually acknowledge, if you go back to 2022 in another paper that they did on climate-related macroeconomic risks and opportunities, they fully acknowledge in this paper many years ago that what people really need, and I say people at the agency level, they're less interested in productivity or economic output, and they're less interested in the macro side of things. What they're really interested in is the acute climate impacts and that integration with CAT models and things that they can look at and estimate at a asset level, because this is really where their exposure rests. And it's how they think about it in terms of portfolio management, enterprise risk management, climate management more broadly. So they exist on some level, but they're quite poor. They're experimental for the most part, and they're just not particularly accessible.
That all sounds like top-down macro stuff, but what about the bottom-up stuff?
Yeah, so interesting question. So GAO goes into this. And again, GAO love the work. It's so rigorous and insightful. I thought I understood this. I thought I followed this stuff pretty well. And I always learned something from their work, but particularly from this paper. So anyway, there is a bunch of sectoral work that I would call bottom-up work. And one is EPA, and they have something called the Framework for Evaluating Damages and Impacts, FREDI. It covers 25 sectors, mostly aligned with different RCPs and different scenarios, RCP scenarios. And those models have been used within the National Climate Assessment. It hasn't really been updated, particularly for a number of years, but it is open source. And in a way, I raised the question with some people, like, why hasn't FREDI been more widely utilized? And I think what some people told me was that, because this is amazing, it's 25 sectors, different scenarios, it feels like potentially robust. And I'm not an expert in this regard, but I want to understand why wasn't this more widely utilized? And I think what people told me was like, this sets up a scenario for when you don't have adaptation, right? It's setting up what these impacts are without adaptation. And it's just not parametrically designed to account for different types of policy interventions or risk reduction interventions or adaptation or resilience interventions that would otherwise shift the calculus on exposures and sensitivity and ultimately a broader fiscal exposure. It has its limitations, certainly opportunities for advancement in the future. OMB, they have done some bottom-up analysis, but not terribly all that useful. There is other areas of climate econ information that GAO highlights. There's all the work that's gone into social cost of carbon. There's also work that is tracked in terms of direct cost to individuals, mostly from extreme events. And then, of course, finally, there's the actual federal funding, appropriations, supplemental appropriations, and, of course, some tax expenditures that are relevant. You know, there is information out there primarily in a historic context, but in general, we have pretty experimental and we have a lot of experimental macro perspectives. There's not a lot of consensus. And the ground up kind of sectoral modeling is just not as developed and probably not as well resourced as it could or should be. And so it sets us up into this situation that we need to invest I came away with this thinking, wow, we probably need to invest in Freddie and the EPA and think about how we can more broadly communicate and train people in that. But of course, as we move into Trump 2.0, it's hard to imagine that anybody at EPA is going to have any kind of investment going forward. And it makes me wonder the extent to which the private sector is going to step in here and how potentially dangerous that could be, particularly if it's operating outside the bounds of consensus of science and social science that otherwise validate that work.
All right, Jesse, we're working through a lot of material here, or you mainly are working through a lot of material here. Let's talk about a national climate information system. What is that recommendation all about?
Yeah, and I think we can group the idea of a national climate information system, and also the idea is they call for a consistent approach to prioritizing climate investments. It's interrelated because you need a system of standardization and validation that can then help you more objectively allocate resources. But let's focus in on the national climate information system, because the question is, where do we get this information, the climate data and climate services and the like? In 2023, there was the Fast Track Action Committee on Climate Services. This is buried within the National Science and Technology Council, and they published a wonderful report it's called the Federal Framework and Climate Action for Climate Services. And they really highlight a couple of things. One, the state of climate services procurement from the private sector is quite poor. We're in the federal government procuring a lot of pretty marginal and sometimes very low quality climate services. Two, and this is the bigger problem that I think Congress can address, and there's opportunities for congressional movement here, is that a lot of times it's easier for agencies and departments to go to a third-party private contractor to contract for climate services than it is to get that data and information from within the federal government. There's all kinds of barriers, legal barriers, privacy barriers, you name it. There's a lot of constraints on the ability within the federal government to share data, information, et cetera, et cetera. It's easier sometimes, many times, to go to the third-party providers. And that's extremely problematic, particularly in the area where a lot of this lives behind black boxes. Now, other information comes from the U.S. Global Change Research Program. They have a whole adaptation chapter, but that's really just looking at the science, and it has a pretty deep social justice bend to it, not nearly as comprehensive as what agencies need. Now, to give Office of Science and Technology Policy some much earned credit, there's usually one person there that works on adaptation over the years. They published a really great report, selecting climate information to use in climate risk and impact assessments in 2023. Super useful, particularly if you're an agency or department. These are the RCPs. This is the SSPs, which is the social science or population or human behavior dimension. It's like a scenario, but centered on people for different climate scenarios. And the resilience interagency working groups under the National Climate Task Force have been doing personnel training, right? They've been doing agency level adaptation planning, training for planners. They've been mainstreaming climate functions into mainstreaming administrative functions. But at the end of the day, this is the first generation of subject matter expertise. It's not like climate mitigation or renewable energy where you have generations of people who've been working on this slowly but surely. This is really the first generation of people in public service who've been in public administration who've been working on this. So they're building this capacity, this human capacity from the ground up. So the broader question is, okay, so some things are happening. We're training people. We're organizing things. There is a need for a national climate information system because it's very spread. The data and the information are spread in a lot of different places. It's not terribly accessible. It requires a fair amount of sophistication to understand how to apply and appropriately for your use case, apply and construct certain types of analyses. So what might a climate information system look like? You can think about this from a public sector point of view and a private sector point of view. What the public sector really needs is a moonshot program, right? We need to standardize and integrate a lot of different types of data. We need to have peer review validation for specific use cases. We need, particularly in the context of procuring private sector data, we need to be able to manage the integration, the sharing, the licensing, the privacy, the intellectual property, and the legal authorities for federal users. None of that is sorted out right now. And at the end of the day, one of the big things that we really need is to build consensus behind standardized scenarios that can be applied to particular types of assets, particular types of portfolios in particular, so that we can have some internal consistency and we can compare apples to apples. At the end of the day, particularly as it relates to the private sector, we need to have internal review of black box models to understand that we are appropriately procuring the highest and best quality data from the best quality service providers that are advancing their science and their practices consistent with the nature of consensus-based science. There's just no getting around that. So the question is, do we certify data outputs? Do we certify climate services providers? Maybe you could validate a data set, but it's going to change over time. They're dynamic. All of these data sets are dynamic. They also integrate. What would happen if a certified data set integrated with a non-certified? You're probably going to need some kind of authentication technology to keep up with that. So it's like easy to say that, yeah, we could review this stuff and behind closed doors and we can validate it. But I think it's difficult to control, and you really need to think thoroughly about how that interoperability, but also the dynamic nature of that data is used and applied. The other question is, do we certify climate services providers? And this came up in that fast track report that I just cited, and it's come up in conversations the GAO highlights. Are you certifying the controls and the quality assurance, or are you certifying the outputs or the services? And if you're doing that, then where is the legal liability? To what extent are you protecting or shielding good or bad or risky or experimental services? How far can you go in that extent? Usually the government tries to stay pretty far away from that. At best, it certifies controls and quality assurance standards. And at the end of the day, there may also, if the government certifies a bunch of climate service providers, there may be some antitrust implications and some to which there may be problems when there's a kind of narrow list of qualified. It's one thing to have a qualified government procurement contractor. It's a whole other thing to say, go out to the marketplace and say, these are the people that are certified to do the work more broadly. And particularly if those private sector service providers that are certified begin to coordinate based on common standards, you do run this kind of antitrust problem. So I'm not sure how exactly you get into this and solve some of these issues, but this is what Congress needs to work on. And there are models, there are some ideas floating out there. But what we do know is that right now, agencies have an obligation, and maybe this won't last for long, but after Trump 2.0, I'm sure it'll pick back up. They have an obligation to look at federal climate risk exposure. The economic models aren't great. The physical climate risk exposures aren't great. It's easier for them to go to the private sector than it is to source it internally within the federal government. And we know that there's a lot of bad apples in the private climate services sector. Some of them are just grossly misspecified in their models. Some of them are more or less negligent. Some of them are super experimental. Some of them aren't really highlighting the degree to which there's uncertainties. Some of them do good work, but don't always apply it in the correct way. It's the Wild West. And we've got to get ahead of that before we make long-term allocations of long-term decisions associated with policy and resource allocations based on bad information. In general, I think when you talk to people, there's a lot of false precision out there. And we have to get more and more comfortable with understanding the degree to which there's uncertainty, even in a kind of perfect world of climate modeling. And we have to be able to translate that uncertainty in the context of planning and fiscal climate risk management. So there's a lot here. It's cut and dry. All of this applies to states. So even in the era of Trump 2.0, some of this might get lost along the way at a federal government level. But again, I think this is something that has bipartisan appeal principally because red states generally are a good bit more exposed in many important dimensions of climate impacts than other states. This is something we just have to continue to chip away on. It's the big picture. And if conservatives are true fiscal conservatives and you really want to cut the debt and cut wasteful government spending, this is a really good place to start for Musk.
Nice nod to one of my episodes, Wild West of Climate Modeling. There's a lot of interest, and that was with Madison Condon. And I just want to ask you, as we close this section out, I did an episode with Dr. Carolyn Kuski, and we talked about Florida and insurance, but she talked about that there in the state, they actually have a process where there's like a commission or committee that actually gets to look inside the black box.
Yeah, in Tallahassee.
And she said that the process actually is somewhat legitimate. I think it remains to be seen long term, but are you familiar with that whole process?
Yeah, and that's one of several different models by which the state regulators or just regulators in general. This is true at the FDA, for instance, with drug approval, where you get to look behind the intellectual property, behind closed doors, evaluate it, have outside experts come in and in the case of cat risk and wind modeling and hurricanes and things like that, stress test it and challenge its underlying validity, and actually with the goal of trying to make it better or see where it fails. So yeah, that's a model, and that's a model that we need to carry forward at the federal government before we procure any more dicey. Now, I don't want to say that all third-party private sector climate service providers are no good, or it is a lot less. There are some that are better than others. It's people, for the most part, are working really hard and trying to get it right. And in some areas, we are making advancements, and those advancements are important. They're doing things that the federal government hasn't been resourced to do. They're taking risks. They're taking risks in R&D where the federal government really hasn't in recent years. So I don't want to look down on it entirely. I think we have to recognize that we've got to be able to weed out the bad apples, because it's going to bring the entire sector and undermine public's confidence in this information in the long run if we don't really get to this ahead of time.
Jesse, you took us through this comprehensive look at the report. Now, for my listeners, think about all my listeners out there who have different jobs across state government, local government, nonprofit, academics. How should they use this report? How could it be helpful to them?
I think in both the public and the private sector, there's an ambition to understand the physical exposure of their assets across their portfolio. And on some level, this is a maturing field of applied climate analytics to understand physical risk exposure. And we're limited by that sort of, in many ways, lack of maturity. But at the same time, I think it's important to have controls in place to begin to think about these things, particularly in qualitative terms, right? We don't necessarily need precise estimates or figures that get us some kind of probabilistic understanding. A lot of times our emerging intelligence around this is qualitative, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I think in many ways, this is a model of ambition and a model of how we think about climate risk management that applies not just to the federal government, but all types of agencies and organizations, no matter where you are. So I think a lot of the analogs here scale. And so it's about anticipating that these are going to be questions and these are going to be challenges that come up that if they aren't already resident now. So it translates, and I think it translates well. You have to be prepared. Now's the time to put these controls in place.
All right, we just went through 5 of these policy recommendations. Now, you might not want to do this, but you know how it is. You don't always get everything that you want. If you had to prioritize 1 or 2 of these recommendations is something, they really went to the mat to get across, do you think that are priorities?
Yeah, I think developing a national strategy and a national plan, and plans and strategies are distinct in some fundamental ways. And I think we've been conflating it in this episode. But I think by extension, the idea that we need a national adaptation plan that covers adaptation resilience, of course, is really critical. And I think that process that one, by developing that plan and recognizing that it's a living document, it's a living series of documents, really, that's about the process. It's about how you get there. That brings in a lot of different stakeholders across sectors and perspectives, methods, is really something that will yield positive benefits. It also gives you direction and allows for consensus to find a home and a place. And listen, there's trade-offs along the way. There's going to be winners and losers along the way. But the more clear we are in terms of our policy goals and sending signals about the lack of sustainability that currently exists in various systems of infrastructure and finance and fiscal exposure and everything else they talk about, the more clear we are about that, the better off we are collectively. And again, this translates at the federal level, but it also translates if you're a state and local government. It's about the process of developing that plan, not necessarily what that plan represents in its final culminated published form.
Yeah, I agree. It could be such a guiding light to, I think, a lot of other activities. And so there's a huge opportunity there. You've talked about this a little bit, but we really haven't gone into much detail. But we have to acknowledge this is recorded after the 2024 presidential election. Donald Trump has been elected president, and so he'll be coming in with his administration. So this will have huge implications for climate change work in the federal government. Can you just give us a few more thoughts on what do you think this might mean, especially in the context of this GAO report we went through?
Yeah. So on some level, this GAO report would, like a lot of GAO reports, is sponsored by members of Congress, and it becomes the empirical basis or rationale for advancing some level of legislation or some type of legislation that's addressing the problems that GAO sets up, right? GAO is not policy prescriptive or normative. but they do set up the problems and potential solutions to those problems. For as much as any kind of responsive legislation might feel dead on arrival at this very moment, if you're truly a fiscal conservative and you care about the fiscal deficit and budget, and at least rhetorically, as it has been projected by the Republican Party, then you should care about climate, because the climate dimensions here, the extreme weather dimensions as they frame it, forget the language for a second. You could retitle all of this, and I'm not saying this is the right thing to do or this is scientifically justifiable, but politically you could retitle all of this in the interests of extreme weather and just remove climate change, and it's still going to have the same, maybe not the same analytical effect, but it's going to have the same political result, which is that we have to manage our fiscal liability and our federal exposure here in the long term. And these are real costs. This is real risk of declining revenue and tax revenue and declines in GDP and et cetera, et cetera. This pieces of these policy ideas may survive in different ways. I wouldn't completely rule it out. At the end of the day, I think it's useful for our listeners to recognize 2 points. One, Trump 1.0 as distinguished from Trump 2.0 is who knows how those distinctions manifest in terms of how the agencies are deconstructed and reassigned in different ways. But all things considered, a lot of climate work did continue to move forward during Trump 1.0, and there's a lot of dimensions that would think it would continue to move forward in Trump 2.0. In part, of course, that happens at the Defense Department, it happens at FEMA and elsewhere. But the other part of this is, from a very practical political point of view, red states are disproportionately being hit hard by climate events and climate impacts. There's a lot of demand among Republican governors and voters to continue to amplify investments in pre-hazard mitigation and post-disaster reconstruction. And there's a groundswell of demand that's not going to change with a political or presidential administration. And it's hard to imagine that some of the advances that we've had in legislative advances and administrative and policy and programmatic advances that we've seen, particularly at DHS and at FEMA, are going to, in fact, if anything, it's just going to see greater demand for these policies and programs. Reality check is a tough one. And if I sound optimistic, it's a tempered optimism that the world will not end in this regard, but no doubt we will lose ground, particularly at an agency adaptation level, agency adaptation plans, which are no doubt be rolled back. But when it comes to the structural mechanisms of the deployment of infrastructure capital and post-disaster, pre-disaster investments, I don't think a lot's going to change in that regard. So at least in the small world of adaptation, which, by the way, the federal government really doesn't do a lot, all things considered. The federal government really plays a pretty minor role. Most of adaptation investments, policy planning, and the like is really state and local, for the most part local. The federal government hasn't played a big role to date across the country in driving these things. If the federal government steps back, it's not going to have a huge implications, I would argue, for where most of the work happens, which is local. Again, tempered optimism that the world will not end, but who knows?
But who knows? All right. That's a good way to end it. I worked for the federal government during the Obama years, Department of Interior, and involved with a lot of the adaptation planning that went on. And what was very frustrating is that you just had those 4 lost years when the previous Trump administration. And then when all these things were happening, you and I touched base like, wow, we did this 8, 9, 10 years ago. And here it is starting from scratch. And so it just, to me, represents a huge lost opportunity. And again, they'll have to start over in some areas. So,
yeah. And Doug, we've talked about this going back to Clinton and Bush and multiple transitions where we've been involved in various policies and programs. And there is this cycle of on and off. I think the biggest challenge as I see it is the loss of personnel and expertise. Yeah. And what I would anticipate is, particularly at the Department of Energy and elsewhere, we will see an exodus of people from the federal government who are recently onboarded with a lot of subject matter expertise shift their focus to state and local governments, and particularly more progressive states and more wealthy local governments. And so there's going to be a shift towards private enterprise and towards local and state policy. And so the brain trust and the human capital component of this, it's going to go somewhere. There will no doubt be people who take early retirement from the federal government, and we lose those people and that institutional knowledge for forever. And that's been a huge drain at EPA. In the Biden years, the EPA has just been completely fallen off the mark when it comes to adaptation. But at the end of the day, we recognize that those ideas, that those human components to the administration of the government, federal government, will simply shift elsewhere. And so they're not lost forever. So anyway, I hear what you're saying. There's on and off, and we lose a lot of institutional knowledge along the way. But at the same time, people take their expertise elsewhere.
All right, Jesse, we're wrapping things up here, but you've got something very exciting on the horizon. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I've got a new book coming out on Oxford University Press that comes out in time for climate season 2025, for better or for worse, depends on how you look at it. The title of the book is North, the Future of Post-Climate America, and it's examining, I hope in pretty rigorous terms, about how and where we are going to live in the face of climate change. And that is understood through the lens of demography and population mobility and our standard of living, and really challenging some major assumptions that we have about what connects us to our communities and to places. And we're going to look at this through the economics and through demography and human behavior and affective reasoning and complicated modeling and agent-based modeling. We're going to look at it through a lot of different lenses. And I think it's very interesting. I think I feel like I've finally done something with my life because I finally memorialized a pretty comprehensive understanding of adaptation science and policy as a kind of background, because all of this is set in the context of adaptation. And so I think it's doing a lot. And the final chapter is actually a work of fiction, and I sold it as a type of scenario, but it's really climate fiction, and it tries to bring together a lot of these aspects of human mobility and design and economics and engineering and policy, and trying to bring them together into setting the landscape of a world that we might be living in for better or for worse. So a lot of the themes of my years of work in adaptation and in teaching and research are really fleshed out, I hope, in an enjoyable read and an informative read for people. So it comes out sometime around next summer. So I'm super, super excited. North, the Future of Post-Climate America, Oxford University Press. So be on the lookout for it. It'll go on pre-sale soon.
All right. Fantastic, Jesse. I'm looking forward to reading it myself, and we'll obviously have to get you back on just around the time that it's being published, and we can dig into it a bit more. So that's very exciting. It is always a pleasure to have you on. You've been with the podcast almost since the beginning. You're an executive producer. You've been a regular guest. It always is a treat to have you on.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Doug.
Okay, Adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to Alfredo Gomez from GAO for joining the podcast and sharing what's in the report. And thanks to his staff for reaching out to me originally when the report was published. I highly recommend you take the time and go through it. Links are in my show notes. They have captured many of the most important adaptation issues facing the country, and they have very specific recommendations to Congress that we could all benefit from. And thanks to Dr. Jesse Keenan for coming on for that deeper dive into the report. It's always a treat to have Jesse on. He's been coming on since the beginning of this podcast, sharing his vast expertise in adaptation. When it comes to these reports, I like bringing in Jesse. As you have learned, no one can capture what's in these reports like Jesse can. And also be on the lookout for early ordering options for his book coming out next summer. All right. Imagine showcasing your organization's achievements to a vast network of climate and adaptation professionals through an American Adapts podcast. Sponsoring an episode gives your company the perfect platform to tell your adaptation story and share your message with an influential audience. Go beyond the limits of webinars and white papers. Let's create a compelling podcast episode that highlights your organization's remarkable work. Together, we'll identify the experts who best represent your achievements and craft a story that resonates with members, funders, and board members while leaving a lasting impact. Podcasts offer enduring value, continuing to educate and inspire long after the release. I've partnered with prestigious organizations like Battelle, NRDC, World Wildlife Fund, UCLA, Harvard University, and many more. I'd love to add your organization to that list. Ready to make an impact? Email me at americadapts@gmail.com to learn more about how podcast storytelling can elevate your message and amplify your mission. Okay, Adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.